Welcome to the Writing 2 presentation on Annotated Bibliographies. Much of the content for this presentation comes from Chapter 11 in How to Write Anything, so I encourage you to have your book open and use that as a reference while you watch this presentation. What is an annotated bibliography? Well, let's give a quick definition. It's an alphabetical list of sources and documents that generally you've been using to develop a research project. Though I'm going to butt in here and say, and I'm going to add this to what the book definition is here, is that there are going to be some projects that you have that may only be an annotated bibliography. Sometimes the instructor or professor only wants you to come up with the annotated bibliography even if you aren't writing a specific paper from it. So they can be a project in and of themselves. In an annotated bibliography, you're going to have each item on the list summarized, and often you're going to have it evaluated. In other words, you're going to discuss why you would use this source, what positive and negative aspects of it there might be, and so on. We'll learn more as we go along in this presentation. Making an annotated bibliography is pretty straightforward. Of course, first you're going to need to actually do all this research, and as you research, it helps to put the citations as they would be in your Works Cited page for MLA or References page for APA, and go ahead and list those as you're researching and make some notes. That's what I would recommend doing. We've talked about this in other research projects in Writing 1 and Writing 2, so that should come as no surprise. But make some notes and start writing about the things that you want to put into your annotated bibliography as you're doing your research. As you get further along in your career, you're going to end up doing other formats as well. For example, Chicago style, and there are other fields that have their own specific style that they might want. Now, you may want to consider down the road in other projects that you do, including a works consulted list. And what that is that's for sources that you might read, but you didn't actually cite in your paper. So in other words, you didn't directly use them in your paper, but you still read them and they shaped your thinking, and so you definitely want to still give them credit in some way. For each listing in your annotated bibliography, then, you're going to want to summarize a source. Now, we're talking in this particular presentation, we're talking about an annotated bibliography in probably its more advanced form than what some of us have done. Some of us in freshman papers and maybe even in high school, we've done annotated bibliographies that are focused primarily just on the summarizing, but we're going to work on doing more evaluation and talking about how we are going to use our sources. So when you do that, you only want to use 1 or 2 sentences to do the actual summary. What is a summary? Hopefully you know by now. If not, you might want to go look at the chapter on summarizing sources that's listed at the bottom of this screen. But here are the key elements. First, you're going to give a quick description of what the source actually is. So if it's a report about something, or if it's a review of something, or an interview, you're just going to use the word that best describes it. And then you're going to describe the contents, so what it's about, the scope, so in other words, is it narrow, is it broader, what does it focus on, and to what degree either a narrow focus on something or a broad focus on the larger issue. You might talk about who it's written for, an audience. You might also discuss the perspective it has. So specifically, if it has a particular agenda or bias that it seems to have, or if it's coming at it from an objective researcher point of view, things like that. You can find other features that might be relevant to your project as well, and that's just going to vary on what kind of project you're doing, but you could include those in your summary. Now we're going to get into elements of the annotated bibliography that some students watching this presentation might not have done yet. You want to assess the significance or quality of your source. And while you do this, you're going to use an academic or professional tone. As our book says, you're not writing a movie review here and doing so in an informal way. You want to maintain the tone of a scholar as much as possible. And you're going to evaluate things like what we see this list on here, the authority. So why is the author credible? And that helps your reader know that you have a reason for using this source because the author or the organization has some credibility related to this topic. You're going to discuss how thorough it is. So maybe it's only talking about one aspect of the particular topic. Maybe it's going to cover it in a lot more detail and be very thorough. So you want to mention that, and that can be a pro or a con depending on what you're trying to do. You're going to want to discuss its length. In other words, is it long enough that you feel like you can use it, or does it just barely get into depth? You also want to look at how relevant it is to the actual topic, because you may consult a source. As we said, there's sometimes a works consulted. Maybe you consulted a source and it had a little bit of information, but most of the article was not particularly relevant to your topic. And that kind of relates also to usefulness. And okay, how much can you use from this source? Sometimes you can use a lot, sometimes you can use a little, but you'll want to evaluate that a little bit here. You also want to discuss its age and whether it's up to date or dated. And we've talked before about how sometimes older sources are fine, especially if we are writing about an older topic. And there are times where when you're researching something, it's actually very beneficial to have access to writing about it at the time so you can see what the reaction was at the time among scholars or other medical professionals or others who are in that field or others who would have reacted. For example, sometimes in literature, we're writing about plays or books that came out at a certain time, and it's actually helpful to see what the reviewers were saying about it at the time, because sometimes as time goes on and as reviewers and literary critics get time with a piece, we change our ideas about it, or we start looking at it more closely in terms of its context, or we sort of, as a society, change a little bit and we might view the story a little bit differently. So again, the age of a review in a literature sense might really relate to how you want to talk about that story and how that story or play has been perceived over time. So again, that's not to say that just because something is old doesn't mean you should use it, but you do want to mention it here and why that might be a good idea to use something of that age. In some cases, you're doing topics that you want the most updated information, so you want to make sure you explain why you think it's great to use a source because it is up to date. You also want to include something about the reputation in the field. That might be of the author or whomever did the research, things like that. Some of that you may or may not know at this point in your careers, but as you move along and get more thoroughly entrenched in your fields, this will help you. And being entrenched in your field and knowing more about it, you'll, again, that activeness within your field will help you know who has what reputations, and you'll be able to write more about that. There may be other factors that you would include here as well, and I'm open to that in projects. The other element often found in annotated bibliographies is to explain the source's role in your own research. So what we mean by that is, how are you going to use it, or how do you plan to use it in your writing or whatever project it is, whether it's a term paper or a proposal or something like that. So some sources we use because we want to provide creative or fresh ideas, and that's especially true when we're looking for different alternative or diverse perspectives. So sometimes there's some overlap there, but with the providing creative or fresh ideas in particular, sometimes you want to challenge your audience with ideas that are outside of the norm for that field, and so you specifically would want to find sources that provide ideas that really aren't thought about very much or hadn't been considered before. You also do want to offer alternative or diverse perspectives. This is important in various settings that people in your audience will want to see that you considered a few different points of view. So this is very good. In some cases, for example, in a straightforward argument paper, you might be asked to include an opposing perspective. So you would definitely want to make note of which sources you're using to do that. You also want to explain if a role is being, or if a source is being used as an authority. And there are times where we bring in certain sources because they give us a lot of information, but also because they're considered the leading authority in that field. They're the most credible researcher that you can find, or the most credible organization you can find. So if we're doing a presentation or a paper or whatever on perhaps maybe a pandemic or a virus that could be spreading, the Center for Disease Control, you're going to want to use that source probably because they are one of the most credible sources for that, or the World Health Organization. So you might say in your annotated bibliography, part of the reason for using this source is because they are authoritative and considered one of the leading sources for information about diseases or whatever. Again, you might be including your source to provide the most updated research, or as we discussed in the presentation, to discuss research from a particular time and place, or a context, or a culture, or whatever. You might include research specifically to include descriptive examples. So maybe you're using a source because it has a story that relates to whatever point you're trying to make or whatever you're exploring. So a news report or someone's other writing. And again, credibility is an issue here, so you would want to include that as well. But having a good descriptive example to draw on to explain something to your readers is helpful. So you can say that that's why you're using it. Same kind of goes for case studies. So you may have other that you're using a source in your paper as well. And so in an annotated bibliography, you could definitely include that reason. Thanks for watching, everybody, and good luck on those projects.